My name is Carol B. Gambrell. I was born in Birmingham, Alabama, grew up there and went to school and joined the Army at the University of Alabama, where I was an engineering student. I joined the Reserve Corps thinking that they'd let me finish that year of schooling, and that was the promise made by those who signed me up. It didn't happen. And about 2 months later, they called me to active duty, and I was there till after the war was over. I left there and went to basic training, and from there the Army was, it turned out, was short of very technical help, and they sent me to Yale University to study engineering for about 15 months, and then the Battle of the Bulge occurred, and they canceled the program and sent most of the people back to Patton's infantry. In my case, they sent me to the combat engineers on field duty in Tennessee, and so I went from sleeping in a regular bed to a pup tent in a dust storm. And other than that, why, things leading up to that particular point were not terribly interesting, but the combat engineers did all kinds of work, as it turned out. We even merged with the infantry sometime in Europe. When the infantry was not able to do all of its job at one time, we helped out. As it turned out, we went overseas to England, first of all, and received all of our equipment, which a lot of it was unusually heavy equipment items for building roads and bridges primarily. And then we boarded ship, loaded all the equipment on ship, and across the channel we went to Le Havre, France. It turned out the German submarines were sinking vessels just outside the port. And we who were on board ship were wondering if we shouldn't sleep in our life preservers so that we be prepared should we enter the water. It turned out that we made it out all right, off board ship, onto land, and proceeded to move toward the central part of Europe. And there were skirmishes along the way.
What countries in the central part of Europe?
In those days, the countries were a bit different than they are now. We went off-boarded ship in France. We went through Belgium, a brief stay in Holland, and then on to what was called Central Europe, or primarily Germany. And we got to see a lot of the countryside, and the infantry was proceeding ahead of us, and the troops that were to follow. The supply line was unusually long and was full of goods moving up to the front to support the soldiers who were in the firing position, particularly food and ammunition. The artillery was a little bit behind because they fired over everyone's head. As things went along, the Bulge, as probably history books now show it, accomplished a lot because it stopped the Germans. The Germans had captured a lot of our uniforms and had suited up. They gathered all of their soldiers that they could find who spoke good English, suited them up in our own uniforms, and sent them out as spies to tell them where our troops were located and what they were doing. And that worked pretty well for a while until we started using a system of words to identify our legitimacy, and that seemed to clear them out pretty well. And in one of the questions that was often asked, who was Babe Ruth? And most of the Germans never heard of him, and we right away had done what's required to capture somebody. And we did a few of those things. The Germans were quite well trained and moved ahead with efficiency, and pushed our troops back, and the troops that were vulnerable in the line of attack were mostly new and green troops and were not terribly experienced in what to do under combat, and that caused a break in the line, but it didn't take long for us to learn how those things operated, and they then restored themselves rather well. The bulge was over after, I believe, maybe like a couple of weeks, maybe 3 weeks at the most, and we moved on into Central Europe. And it was not long we were approaching the Rhine River. That was a big landmark for us to accomplish, and all of our troops, we just knew once we got across the Rhine, it would be easy pickings to move all the way and meet up with the Russians some distance in front of us. That was our big objective in those days. Well, it turned out when I believe it was the 7th Armored Division approached the Rhine River and the gigantic Ludendorff Railroad Bridge at Remagen. And they found that the bridge had not been blown, although explosives had been placed all along the bridge in hopes, the Germans did, in hopes that they would blow the bridge and curtail our advance. Well, it further turned out that some of the explosives that they were using had been made in Italy, and some of those very enterprising Italians had sabotaged some of the explosives, and they didn't go off. Although a number of them did, they blew big holes in the floor of the bridge. And by the way, the bridge was truly a railroad bridge. It had no floor. So the troops that ran off over the bridge in the very beginning had to jump from cross tie to cross tie, and some of them fell through between and had to resurrect themselves. So one of our jobs as an engineering unit was to put a floor in the bridge so that vehicles and foot troops could move across the bridge with safety. In the meantime, the Germans had backed off quite some distance on the eastern side of the river and behind a small mountain range with their 88 artillery pieces, and they kept shooting artillery shells onto the bridge. The bridge was a flying girder bridge, which was quite large and quite high, and some of those shells landed among the structural component members up in the air above the floor of the bridge, and after about 10 days of that kind of activity, the bridge fell in the river on the 17th of March. And my unit was on the bridge, and I was scheduled to be on the bridge, and something delayed me. Very possibly that's the reason that I made it through the war with safety. After that had taken place, we moved on to Central Europe, and we encountered some difficulties here and there in support of the infantry, and when the infantry could not move forward with ease or had to collapse themselves a bit, we moved in, and we did liberate several towns on our own. In one case, I've forgotten the name of the town, but we divided ourselves up and began to survey the town with armed rifles and so forth in hand. And I had the part of the city where there happened to be a motorcycle shop. And I opened the door and went into the shop, and there staring me in the face was a beautiful, brand new Bosch motorcycle. And I just knew that I better take that motorcycle or someone else would take it. So I rode off into that motorcycle, and I kept it for quite a while, and our motor pool had gigantic trailers for hauling the heavy equipment around, and one of my friends in the motor pool used to carry my motorcycle from town to town, and when I got to a new town, I rode the motorcycle. Well, We were in the little town of Aslar, Germany, and we were, several of us were sleeping in the Burgermeister's house up on the hill, long driveway and all that. And I woke up one Sunday morning and I thought, well, things are pretty calm around here. I'll just take a ride on the motorcycle. So I did. I got on, went down the driveway to the main road, turned to the right, and went in the direction of the next community. Well, when I got to that community, I realized I didn't even have a weapon with me. German soldiers were leaving the army and returning to civilian life, and I wondered, well, which one of them's going to get me? And I thought, well, Gambrell, you just better wake up around here and turn this motorcycle around and get back to your unit. So excuse me, I swung around, and don't you know, the street surface were cobblestones that had moisture on them almost all the time. That motorcycle flew out from under me and went off by itself. So then I thought, well, boy, I'm really in trouble now. I can't get back to my unit. The motorcycle probably won't run. So what am I going to do? And I said the quick, strongest prayer I ever prayed in my life. And I went over and picked up the motorcycle, cranked it up, and it popped off right away. So I got on it and I rode back to my unit, to the motor pool, and the first person I saw, I rode up to him and said, hey, you want a motorcycle? And he said yes. So I gave him my motorcycle. And that was a big contribution on my part. It turned out the communications department of our unit needed a motorcycle. And they convinced him that he should turn the motorcycle over to them. They strung wire for messages between our units, and that was a big and very unpleasant job. So with the motorcycle at hand, they could carry messages back and forth to the various units much more efficiently than stringing wire and handling of things like that. I was in my unit, the very famous, later on, very famous baseball player Warren Spahn received a battlefield commission. And he and I and several other unit members of the unit were left behind when the war was over, and our unit was scheduled to be transferred to the Far East. And we, in staying behind, had to turn in all of that equipment that we had, which was a monster of a job. And that took place. And once we cleared the unit of all of its possessions, we were transferred to another unit, in my case, the 100th Infantry Division, which brought me home. I was discharged at Fort McPherson, Georgia, and went back to civilian life. And fortunately, I stayed in the reserve. And although I reached the grade level of a sergeant in active duty during the war, through the reserve, I eventually became a lieutenant colonel and retired as a lieutenant colonel in the Army. Thank you very much.
Fantastic.